Chapter 25. My friend, Andy Rooney. Andy Rooney was known by everyone. He was a household name. You either loved him or hated him. Many folks agreed with him and many disagreed. Andy was most familiar to America as the curmudgeonly and grouchy commentator closing out the CBS Weekly 60 Minutes news documentary since the 70s. Having listened to his commentaries for many years, I was always intrigued by the way he could write just about anything and everything. During an interview on CNN with Larry King, he actually said that he could write about the head of a pin. In completing one of his books, it appeared he was right. Andy wrote about the things he liked and the things he didn't, along with the things he would and wouldn't do. During one commentary, he had an array of sport drinks on his desk. Being inquisitive of what some of the drinks tasted like by looking at the color, he said that he would never drink anything blue. Somehow a paperback book written by Andy Rooney had found me. After reading it, I handed it off to someone else. While shopping at a second-hand store on the road somewhere in Indiana, a couple of other hard copies of Andy's caught my eye. Of course, I bought them. Upon completing the first one, Andy seemed like a long-lost friend, causing me to almost feel like I knew him. There were certain conditions that he put across to his readers. He wouldn't just sign anything, but he would sign his books or his photos if asked. He also mentioned that he enjoyed being complimented for his work. Who doesn't? Knowing some of his conditions, I slipped a note into one book and mailed it to him in New York requesting an autograph. I really attempted to stay within his required parameters. A self-addressed postage-paid envelope was also included. Sometime later, the book showed up in the mail at my home, signed, Andrew Rooney. It made me very happy. A year or two later, I was sitting in my motorhome on the Wyoming prairie outside of a club I was working in when I completed a second book of Andy's. Instead of having the book bounce around the RV while traveling, writing a quick note to Andy and putting it in the mail to him seemed like a better idea. I decided to include a note to Andy letting him know that I would be in New York City in a few weeks visiting and sitting in with Les Paul and his trio at their regular Monday night show at the Iridium Jazz Club. The note was handwritten on a yellow legal pad since I didn't have a printer in the motorhome. The book and note were mailed and basically forgotten about. While I was in Arizona a few weeks later, my wife told me that I received a personal letter from Andy Rooney along with the second autographed book. He had typed a note to me on his Royal typewriter, actually crossing out a wrong letter with a pencil. He said he enjoyed receiving the letter and admitted that he did actually remember what the actual letters of the alphabet looked like. It appeared that Andy was impressed that I had taken the time to hold a pen and actually expend the energy to write him manually as opposed to typing on a computer. He stated that he knew nothing about music and couldn't tell one instrument from the other when listening. He did mention a musician friend of his that had passed away within the last few years. That was the extent of any musical conversation. At the end of the letter, Andy included his phone number and invited me to visit him at CBS when I arrived in New York. In the fall, a few months later, I called Andy to tell him I was in the area. We agreed that I would visit him on a Tuesday after sitting in at Les Paul's show the Monday night before. On the way into New York City from the suburbs on Monday night, with my friend Bobby Lyons driving as he always did, I left a voicemail for Andy inviting him to come to the Iridium while I was there. I didn't think he would show up, but I didn't want to rule it out should he choose to accept the invitation. There was only a 12-hour turnaround before I was back on the bus Tuesday morning from Pearl River, New York to keep my appointment with Andy. When contacting him on my phone, he asked where I was. He laughed when I told him I was on the bus. After arriving at the CBS network and being admitted through the security with a guest pass, I rode the elevator to Andy's office. When I walked in, there he was, the man, Andy Rooney in the flesh, avidly typing away. He immediately stopped and shook my hand, saying I was much taller than he pictured. I told him he was exactly as I pictured. In showing him a photo in my camera from the night before with Les Paul, he said that he almost showed up at the Iridium. He said, when I left work, I drove around the block and I saw the people standing outside the club. I knew you were in there, but I just went on home. We sat and talked for a little while about various things, mostly things I knew about him from his book. There were so many things going through my mind, but we just proceeded to have a very cordial visit. He also introduced me to Keith, his producer, and to Susie, his assistant. They were folks I knew about through his books and occasionally from his weekly 60 Minutes features. Having read several of his books by this time, I think I knew Andy pretty well as a little about his wife and children that he wrote of periodically. Andy also enjoyed woodworking at his home in Connecticut and at his vacation home in upstate New York. He had spoken about that often in his books. The desk that he sat behind for so many years on his weekly 60 Minutes features was a piece of furniture that Andy cut from a huge tree by himself. I marveled at that for a few minutes. He showed me around his office and studio, pointing out some of the future pieces he was working on. Here I was in Andy Rooney's little world that he loved. CBS had given him free rein to do whatever he loved best, to write. His office was in a separate area of the building more or less detached from the rest of the CBS operation. Andy's history was amazing. His first job was in the military writing for the publication Stars and Stripes. He had flown with many bombing missions over Normandy during World War II, writing the stories as they happened. The pilots were each to fly 25 bombing missions, then their jobs will be done. That is, if they survived. He spoke emotionally about going to breakfast with many of the guys some mornings, and of the empty places at the table in the evenings of the ones that didn't return. His book, My War, tells the full story of his years in the U.S. Army. Andy's broadcast career also spanned many decades, having written for Harry Reasoner and Arthur Godfrey along the way. No matter what Andy wrote about, I loved reading about it. Toward the end of the visit, Andy agreed to let me sit behind his desk with him for a picture. He also signed another couple of books for me, and that was a great day. I made another visit to Andy a year later on a return visit to New York, this time making it a point to bring his book, My War, for him to sign. He began telling me of an event that he attended the night before that had Tom Brokaw as the featured speaker. Andy loved Brokaw. He said, "Tom is just so smart and so articulate. He's just the best there is." At the same time I replied, "Well, Andy, I believe that Tom Brokaw wrote the foreword in your book, My War, that I brought for you to sign." He said, "Really?" I said, "Yes, I believe so," having recalled seeing Brokaw's name in the book. Here it is, as I searched for it and passed the book to Andy. He thumbed through the front of the book and actually didn't realize that Tom Brokaw had written the foreword in his book. I believe that he probably just forgot about it. Upon appearing to remember while seeing it in black and white, he seemed very impressed. At the end of this visit, Andy invited me to come back and see him next year. "If I'm still here," he said. He also gave me a couple of his latest books, signed, of course. Back on the bus, I began reading one of the books he gave me. Right in the front, Andy wrote that the book was dedicated to his wife, who had passed away 4 years earlier. I felt bad that I didn't know, but I immediately understood why he said he had a small apartment in the city as opposed to commuting back and forth to Connecticut each day. This was my last visit, but we still stayed in touch. Sometime later, I kept reflecting on my visits with Andy and how fortunate I was to have spent the time with him that I did. He wasn't the kind of guy to interact with viewers very often, if at all. It seems that I approached him the right way at just the right time. Suddenly I felt that I needed to write a song about Andy. When I finished the Ballad of Andy Rooney, I sent him an advance copy. Whether or not he liked it, I'm not sure. If I were to guess, he probably thought himself not worthy of such a tribute. The final version was recorded in Nashville and was released as a single, as well as appearing on my 2010 CD, The Rainbow Up Ahead, on my label Blue Storm Records. I made sure that Andy, along with his colleagues at 60 Minutes, received copies. I'm told they got a kick out of the song. Andy passed away on November 4th, 2011, after complications from a minor surgery procedure. The utmost tribute that could have been paid to Andy Rooney was for CBS to not replace him with anybody to fill the empty spot at the end of 60 Minutes. I commend them for that.